Continuing the Naked Civil Servant by Quentin Crisp. Chapter 3. I was now 18, and beginning to feel really uneasy about the future. Openly on the grounds that I was so inadequate to earn a living, and secretly because I suspected that sexually I was quite unlike anyone else in the world. Friends were starting to ask me questions about my private life. Their intention was not unkind, but I was filled with misgiving. "Are you keen on this girl you talk so much about?" a friend of my mother asked. "Good God, no," I replied, putting on a face as though I had just stepped in something. Then I hastily embarked upon a cynical diatribe against all human sentiments. This was the kind of conversation that my mother's friend loved, but I now think that I wasted a rather wonderful woman. If I could simply have told her that, to my bewilderment, I did not think that I was ever going to be able to take a sexual interest in any girl, I'm sure she would have listened. This would have been, at least, a thin rope flung from a tiny island toward the mainland. She would not have believed me, because in those far-off days a homosexual person was never anyone that you actually knew, and seldom anyone that you had met. She would have thought that I had chosen at random a peculiarity that would make me more interesting, but she would not have been shocked. She was my first glimpse of the vie de bohème. Her name was Mrs. Longhurst, a big, strident person of about 40. "I'm longing for one of those bonnets with jet beads on them." By profession, she was a stewardess and sometimes a portrait model. Who cares as long as it brings in some money? She lived in Charlotte Street. I adore all foreigners. In a room whose walls were covered with African knives. Her other room she had let to a nurse who had attended my mother during her 4 years in various nursing homes. After a while this nurse came to dislike Mrs. Longhurst, but at first she thought her a real character. She introduced her as such to my mother and me. Mrs. Longhurst took to me at once, and allowed me to visit her constantly to play pontoon and talk about myself. Her mode of speech was the most exaggerated that I had ever heard. These are the words with which she warned my mother, who longed to leave Battersea, not to try Hampstead. "Don't live in Hampstead, that's where the parents lived, and they were crippled with rheumatism, bedridden. They moved, and what happened? Within a week they were dancing in the streets of Maida Vale." This woman did not fly to extremes, she lived there. I also soon became an adept at this mode of talk, and, with the passing of the years, came to speak in this way unconsciously. Mrs. Longhurst's attitude to homosexuality, as to most things, was a mocking curiosity, but she was never savage. The rest of the world in which I lived was still stumbling about in search of a weapon with which to exterminate this monster, whose shape and size were not yet known or even guessed at. It was thought to be Greek in origin, smaller than socialism, but more deadly, especially to children. At about this time, the well of loneliness was banned. The widely reported court case, together with the extraordinary reputation that Tallulah Bankhead was painstakingly building up for herself as a delinquent, brought lesbianism, if not into the light of day, at least into the twilight. But I do not remember ever hearing anyone discuss the subject except Mrs. Longhurst and my mother. If one is not going to take the necessary precautions to avoid having parents, one must undertake to bring them up. This was what, very cautiously, I was beginning to do with my mother. My father remained invincibly ignorant. When I left King's College, London, needless to say without a diploma in journalism, I could at first find no better occupation than sitting at home getting on my parents' nerves. I became so listless that my mother thought it only polite to regard me as ill. She sent me to her doctor. Without making even the most cursory examination of me, he declared that all I needed was a lesson in life. My father was very annoyed. He realized that he would have to pay a consultation fee for these few glib words. He was lucky that psychology had not yet reached the middle classes. He might have had to pay much more for less. At the time, my own reaction to the doctor's remark was blank incomprehension. Later, when, to vary the monotony of my existence, I took to wandering about the streets of the West End, I stumbled on the very truth that was just what the doctor had ordered. I learned that I was not alone. As I wandered along Piccadilly or Shaftesbury Avenue, I passed young men standing at the street corners who said, "Isn't it terrible tonight, dear? No men about. The Dilly's not what it used to be." Though the Indian boy at school had once amazed us all with the information that in Birmingham there were male prostitutes, I had never believed that I would actually see one. Here they were for all the world to recognize, or almost all the world. A passer-by would have to be very innocent indeed not to catch the meaning of the mannequin walk and the stance in which the hip was only prevented from total dislocation by the hand placed upon it. The whole set of stylizations that are known as camp, a word that I was hearing then for the first time, was, in 1926, self-explanatory. Women moved and gesticulated in this way. Homosexuals wished, for obvious reasons, to copy them. The strange thing about camp is that it has become fossilized. The mannerisms have never changed. If I were now to see a woman sitting with her knees clamped together, one hand on her hip and the other lightly touching her back hair, I should think either she scored her last social triumph in 1926, or it is a man in drag. Perhaps camp is set in the 20s because, after that, differences between the sexes, especially visible differences, began to fade. This, of course, has never mattered to women in the least. They know they are women. To homosexuals, who must, with every breath they draw, with every step they take, demonstrate that they are feminine, it is frustrating. They look back in sorrow to that more formal era and try to relive it. The whole structure of society was at that time much more rigid than it has ever been since, and in two main ways. The first of these was sexual. The short skirts, bobbed hair, and flat chests that were in fashion were in fact symbols of immaturity. No one ever drew attention to this, presumably out of politeness. The word boyish was used to describe the girls of that era. This epithet they accepted graciously. They knew that they looked nothing like boys. They also realized that it was meant to be a compliment. Manliness was all the rage. The men of the 20s searched themselves for vestiges of effeminacy as though for lice. They did not worry about their characters, but about their hair and their clothes. Their predicament was that they must never be caught worrying about either. I once heard a slightly dandified friend of my brother say, "People are always accusing me of taking care over my appearance." The sexual meaning of behavior was only sketchily understood, but the symbolism of clothes was recognized by everyone. To wear suede shoes was to be under suspicion. Anyone who had hair rather than bristle at the back of his neck was thought to be an artist, a foreigner, or worse. A friend of mine who was young, in the same decade as I, says that, when he was introduced to an elderly gentleman as an artist, the gentleman said, "Oh, I know this young man is an artist. The other day I saw him in the street in a brown jacket." The other way in which society in the 20s was rigid was in its class distinctions. Doubtless to a sociologist, there were many different strata merging here and there, but among the people that I was now getting to know, there were only two classes. They never mingled, except in bed. There was them, who acted refined and spoke nice, and whose people had pots of money, and there was us, who were the salt of the earth. Mitford's first law had not then been formulated. I could have put the words toilet, mirror, and perfume all into one sentence. None of the boys on the game would have noticed. I would still have been them because my slight Cockney accent had been flattened out a little. But they forgave me for my unfair advantages, because I was in the same sexual boat as they. I took to them like a duck to ducks. Between these thin barriers of sex and class, we sat huddled together in a cafe called the Black Cat. We were not putting up with any such nonsense as au chat noir, which was written over the window. This was in Old Compton Street. It looked like a dozen other cafes in Soho. It had a horseshoe bar of occasionally scrubbed wood, black and white checked linoleum on the floor, and mirrors everywhere. The deafening glass boxes in which nowadays customers sit and eat with their ankles on view to the public had not then been built. In that happier time, all was squalor and the silence spangled only with the swish of knives and the tinkle of glass as the windows of the Black Cat got pushed in. Day after uneventful day, night after loveless night, we sat in this cafe buying each other cups of tea, combing each other's hair, and trying on each other's lipsticks. We were waited on with indulgent contempt by an elderly gentleman, who later achieved fame that we would have then thought quite beyond him by being involved in a murder case. Had the denizens of the Black Cat known he was such a desperate character, they would doubtless have done much more to provoke him. As it was, we only bored him by making, with ladylike sips, each cup of tea last as long as a four-course meal. From time to time he threw us out. When this happened, we waltzed around the neighborhood streets in search of love or money or both. If we didn't find either, we returned to the cafe and put on more lipstick. It never occurred to any of us to try to be more lovable. Even if it had, I do not think we would have adopted a measure so extreme. Occasionally, while we chattered on the street corner, one of our friends would go whizzing past crying, "They're coming!" At this we would scatter. It meant that, while being questioned, one of the boys had bolted, and his inquisitors were after him. At such times, if a detective saw his quarry escaping, he would seize upon the nearest prey, however innocently that person might be behaving. We treated the police as it is said you should treat wild animals. As we passed them, we never ran, but if they were already running, we spread out so that only one of our number would die. Policemen in uniform were not classed as man-eaters. I had no idea what the rules were, but they never seemed to give chase. They only moved us on. The perpetual danger in which we lived bound us together. In the cafe there was a lot of stylized cattiness, but this was never meant unkindly. Nothing at all was meant by it. It was a formal game of innuendos about other people being older than they said, about their teeth being false and their hair being a wig. Such conversation was thought to be smart, and so very feminine. It was better, I need hardly say, to seem like a truly appalling woman than not like a woman at all. Unfortunately, in this game there seemed to be very few cards in the pack, and a whole evening spent playing it became monotonous. When we were not thus engaged, we talked about our sufferings, and this I greatly preferred. Soon I had learned by heart almost every argument that could be reared in the climate of that time against the persecution of homosexuals. We weren't doing any harm, we couldn't help it, and though this was hardly watertight from a legal point of view, we had enough to bear already. Some speakers even went so far as not merely to excuse our sin, but to glorify it, making it a source of national culture. The great names of history from Shakespeare onward were fingered over and over like beads on a rosary. We did not see that it might particularly be the offense of soliciting that was being condemned. It is hardly a matter for amazement that we did not understand this. Confusion on this point was everywhere. The attitude of the law was arbitrary, bordering on slapdash. Boys arrested for soliciting were found guilty before they had spoken. If they did get a chance to say anything, the sound of their voices only caused the presiding magistrate to increase their sentences. I think the boys were right in assuming that they were being condemned for effeminacy. They also put forward the argument that they went on the streets because they were poor, and that they were poor because they were sacked from jobs if their employers discovered them to be queer. Undoubtedly, this was partly true, but not entirely so. Many of the boys from the Black Cat had other jobs by day, truly improbable ones in some cases. One frail little thing was a plumber's mate. About this were many arch jokes and much rolling of blue-lidded eyes. Young men like this one were prostitutes by vocation, blessed in infancy with gifts for serving the community in a special way. I have known female whores who spoke very bitterly of their calling. If they don't like my face, they can put a cushion over it. I know it's not that they're interested in. But to the boys, this profession never seemed shameful. It was their daytime occupations for which they felt they needed to apologize. In some instances, these were lower class or humdrum, or worst of all, unfeminine. At least whoring was never that. The average woman, unless she is particularly ill-favored, regards loving and being loved as a normal part of life. If a man says he loves her, she believes him. Indeed, some women are convinced they are adored by men who can be seen by all to be running in the opposite direction. For homosexuals, this is not so. Love and admiration have to be won against heavy odds. Any declaration of affection requires proof. So many approaches made to them are insincere, even hostile. What better proof of love can there be than money? A 10-shilling note showed incontrovertibly just how mad about you a man is. Even in the minds of some women, a confusion exists between love and money, if the quantity is large enough. They evade the charge of mercenariness by using the cash they extort from one man to deal a bludgeoning blow of humiliation upon another. Some homosexuals attempt this gambit, but it is risky. The giving of money is a masculine act and blurs the internal image. I have always held the view that the union of two hearts whose incomes are equal is a complete waste of time. If anyone offered me money in exchange for sex, I accepted it gladly, and by money I mean 7 shillings 6pence. I still lived at home, where 2 shillings 6pence a week was all the pocket money that I received. Early in life, I learned that I was not going to be able to afford to set a value on myself. In consequence, I have never had the bother of taking offense, but can decide afresh each time that anything is offered to me, whether I want it or not. Apart from my need for small change, there was another reason for accepting money. It absolved me from the charge of enjoying sex for its own sake. At home it had been explained to me that I must never say that I loved food, hardly that I liked it. How much greater the disapproval would have been for admitting that I liked sex, I could only infer, as the subject was seldom mentioned. To some people, an offer of money is so insulting that they can accept a love token for 10 shillings, but not a 10-shilling note. I never needed to be offered a love token. The cash would do nicely. So far from feeling humiliated, I felt in some measure compensated for all the insults, which carried no fringe benefit of money, that I daily received from other directions. I disliked the coarseness of the situations in which I found myself. Courtship consisted of walking along the street with a man who had my elbow in a merciless grip until we came to a dark doorway. Then he said, "This'll do." These are the only words of tenderness that were ever uttered to me. The venality of my predicament I took calmly. Unlike Desdemona, I could perform the deed, but not say the word. Chapter 4. My outlook was so limited that I assumed that all deviates were openly despised and rejected. Their grief and their fear drew my melancholy nature strongly. At first I only wanted to wallow in their misery, but as time went by, I longed to reach its very essence. Finally, I desired to represent it. By this process, I managed to shift homosexuality from being a burden to being a cause. The weight lifted, and some of the guilt evaporated. It seemed to me that there were few homosexuals in the world. I felt that the entire strength of the club must be prepared to show its membership card at any time, and, to a nature as dramatic as mine, not to deny rapidly became to protest. By the time I was 23, I had made myself into a test case. I realized that it did no good to be seen to be homosexual in the West End, where sin reigned supreme, or in Soho, which was inhabited exclusively by other outcasts of various kinds. But the rest of England was straightforward, missionary country. It was densely populated by aborigines who had never heard of homosexuality, and who, when first they did, became frightened and angry. I went to work on them. The message I wished to propagate was that effeminacy existed in people who were in all other respects just like home. I went about the routine of daily living, looking undeniably like a homosexual person. I had had a lot of practice at school in being the one against the many, but even so I was not prepared for the effect my appearance had on the great British public. I had to begin cautiously. I was from birth an object of mild ridicule because of my movements, especially the perpetual flutter of my hands, and my voice. Like the voices of a number of homosexuals, this is an insinuating blend of eagerness and caution, in which even such words as hello and goodbye seem not so much uttered as divulged. But these outward, natural, and visible signs of inward and spiritual disgrace were not enough. People could say that I was ignorant of them, or was trying without success to hide them. I wanted it to be known that I was not ashamed, and therefore had to display symptoms that could not be thought to be accidental. I began to wear makeup. For a while I still went on as before at home, and never mentioned to my mother anything about the life I lived in the outer world. She once protested that I never brought home any of my friends. I explained, quite truthfully, that she would hate them if I did. She never mentioned the matter again, which I took to be a sign that the protest was formal, and that secretly she would be glad to hear no more on that subject. Once outside the flat, I hurried like a wrong hushed up to the nearest public lavatory and put on my war paint. Then I proceeded calmly wherever I was going. If I wasn't going anywhere, I tried to look as though I was. It became harder and harder to think of places to go and things to do, as it slowly dawned on me that sex was definitely out. A realization that usually leaves people with a lot of spare time. If I was to become Miss Ark's only rival, it wouldn't do to allow myself to be picked up by strange men. This would give people the opportunity to say that I had only adopted an effeminate appearance for this purpose. Actually, from the moment that I began to look really startling, men ceased to make propositions to me. They found it too risky or too distasteful. But even the idea that this might be my intention must be eliminated. I began to walk faster and learned never to look strangers in the eye. Frequently in the street I swept past people I knew quite well. I once did this to my brother. This was just as well. He was with a girl who said, "Did you see that?" To which he replied, "Yes, matter of fact, I've seen it before." Without knowing it, I was acquiring that haughty bearing which is characteristic of so many eccentrics. What other expression would you expect to find on the face of anyone who knows that if he turns his head too quickly, he will see on the faces of others glares of stark terror or grimaces of hatred? Aloofness is the posture of self-defense, but even people who quite liked me said that I felt superior to the rest of the world. I felt scared, and before long I was to have good cause. By constantly complaining that the Battersea flat was sunless, my mother induced my father to buy a house outside High Wycombe. I could not do otherwise than go with them. My sister was by this time married, one of my brothers was abroad, and the other was soon to go. Abroad was thought in those days to have some special advantages for young men of the middle classes, and in this connection the word "scope" was on everybody's lips. As in childhood I had evinced so much distaste for even going outside the front door, my parents made little attempt to send me overseas. In this they were very wise. I don't hold with the broad, and think that foreigners speak English when our backs are turned. Even High Wycombe to me was like a desert at the edge of civilization. As I roamed the fields adjacent to the house, forced by my mother to take her chow for a walk, between the hedges my starved eyes would see mirages of the London Pavilion or the Marble Arch, and I would stumble toward them with little cries. My great fear was that here I might live and die and not matter. Just how distasteful my life was at this time cannot have been apparent to others. A friend of my sister, rushing in where even devils would have feared to tread, remarked, "I wonder what you'd have been like if you'd been a woman. I suppose you'd have lived in the country and kept a dog and played bridge." I was too choked with fury to be able to defend myself against this charge. Among the other objections to this image of me was the fact that I hated animals. I still do. I have enough dumb friends without them. In childhood I had longed to be taught dancing, but nothing ever came of this. In a characteristic fit of indulgence, my mother went so far as to buy me a pair of blocked ballet shoes. She did not know or care that no male dancer, except Mr. Dolan in Train Bleu, had ever worn such things. But she never dared to mention to my father the idea of my becoming a dancer. It would have made him difficult to deal with for days. After the failure of journalism, she hammered away at commercial art as the last door through which it might be possible to push me into the outer world. I was sent to an art school in High Wycombe. I had already done one term at Battersea Polytechnic before we left London, and there had drawn a frog that the principal had thought was a piece of drapery. I don't think that I was taught anything. The only good that came out of my attendance at this school was my meeting there with a girl who was to remain my friend for more than 20 years. She had been crippled by polio and wore a mental splint on one leg. At every step the whole side of her body had to be swung forward by a great effort from the shoulder. Despite this, she was determined not to be left out of things. Her will-power was formidable. Because of her handicap, she was sympathetic to all deformity, and was especially drawn to anyone she felt to be worse off than she. I came into this category. The school at High Wycombe was, naturally, farther out of touch with reality than the one in Battersea. Furniture design was well taught there, because the town was the home of that industry, which many years later formulated the G plan. All other subjects were thought to be rather beside the point. None of the 3 or 4 men who comprised the staff had ever worked in an advertising agency or made freelance commercial art into a paying profession. They would have been secretly ashamed to do so. Advertising was considered in those days a disgraceful trade. As no one felt confident to teach or even control me, I did more or less as I liked. "What are you doing this morning?" "Oh, I don't know. A poster." "What of?" "Coaty's Ashes of Roses." All my posters were exotic. I very much doubt if, at the end of such a piece of dialogue as this, I was shown any advertising that Monsieur Coty had recently put out, or if I was, that I was warned that I must follow closely the existing line. I was encouraged to be original, with some far-fetched results. As I was now 21, and in a class full of girls in gym slips, I seemed, by comparison, a genius, and behaved like one. I went to school, as one might say, in mufti, but my hair and my fingernails were long enough to cause comment from strangers on the way there and back. Chapter 5. My father hated me chiefly because I was revolting, but also because I was expensive. Sometimes he would turn on me at the dinner table and say, "Don't eat so much butter on your bread." To such injunctions I paid even less heed than usual, for our life now seemed to be luxurious. I have since decided that with the move out of London my father had abandoned common sense altogether, and plunged into a financial gamble that in his own way he was shortly to win. We occupied what I would now call a very ordinary 4-bedroom house, and employed a housemaid and a gardener. This last feature of opulence was due, not so much to the size of the garden as to the fact that nothing would have induced me to till or even to scratch the soil. I don't hold with flowers, even when they are as good as artificial ones. We also had a car, but this could hardly be looked upon as a status symbol. Every car that my father bought was broken down. He chose them like this, deliberately, so that he could spend almost all the weekend in the garage repairing them. This was a way of avoiding being with his family. Man goes and buys a car and lies beneath. When he was not tinkering with it, he was making the car the subject of one of our recurring Strindberg dramas. Every Sunday afternoon he asked my mother if she would like to go for a drive. She, who had learned her lines perfectly, said that she would. "Where would you like to go?" My mother then plowed her way conscientiously through the list of places that were within driving distance. She was told that they were too far away, or at the top or bottom of hills that were bad for the car. Then she was allowed to say, "Well, anywhere, I don't mind." "If you don't care where we go," my father would conclude, "we might as well stay at home." But we didn't, and the whole afternoon was hell. About 18 months after we moved to High Wycombe, the dreary ritual of our lives was interrupted by my mother going away for a few days. What caused this to happen I can't remember. Perhaps she left in self-defense. This was a very rare occurrence, as neither my father nor I could boil a kettle unless conditions were favorable. This was further evidence of the rigid sexual structure of the world at this time. Men fetched coal from cellars and hammered nails. Women boiled kettles. You knew where you were, even though you hated it. My father and I got on shakily, but to my amazement, not badly. We spoke to each other. He asked me what I intended to do with my life, and at last I understood that the future was now. Neither of my parents ever said to me, "You're mad, but when you go out into the world you will doubtless meet people as mad as you, and I can only hope that you get on all right with them." Such words as these would have been a great help. Instead, my mother protected me from the world, and my father threatened me with it. My feeling of inadequacy increased steadily. I remember a day when my mother and I stood beside the road at Loudwater Station and waited for my father to emerge from the London train. As we stood there, a stream of men in dark suits and bowler hats went by us. I thought, I'll never be able to get into step with them. I felt as I had in childhood, when two other children turned a skipping rope and urged me to run under it and start jumping. I couldn't do it. Hateful was the dark blue surge. Oh, why should life all labor be? Perhaps I was born a lotus eater, suffering from permanent symptoms of withdrawal. At the end of one of the ominous but not hostile conversations with my father that took place during my mother's absence, he said, "The trouble is, you look like a male whore." This cheered me up a little, as I had not then taken my final vows. I was in a twilight state between sin and virtue. The remark was the first acknowledgment that he had ever made of any part of my problem. In gratitude, I promised that when I went up to London at Christmas, I would try not to come back. Continued in the next installment. And thank you for listening and liking and subscribing.